Chapter 279. The Indian Arranged Marriage, Part 3. Rani Krishna had no plans to allow her daughter to go back to America at this stage. She wanted her daughter to have her first baby with her Hindu husband before any travel plans. Rani thought that the long separation from her last captor and from her infant child would cement her relationship with her husband, and her previous infatuation would fade into the past. Rahul had different ideas. He was keen to conclude the second installment on his dowry and have his name added to the deed of the house. After all, Pooja might change her mind and leave him before he got his share of the agreed-upon dowry. He didn't really care what happened after that. Wisely, he hid his impatience and claimed the urgency for him to finish his final year of medical school. He claimed that his long absence from the medical program was liable to get him taken off the college registrar's list. He stressed that he had already been away for a semester, so dismissal could be imminent. Faced with losing what was probably the single most significant attribute of her son-in-law, Rani had no intention of losing the social status of introducing her son-in-law as Dr. Patel, Harvard University, MD. Rani suggested that her son-in-law should go back alone and leave his wife with her. Rahul, not entirely comfortable with the idea of leaving his leverage behind, insisted on taking Pooja with him. He had no intention of returning to India. When they reached a stalemate, Rani suggested that Pooja should conceive before leaving for the States. It seemed like a fair compromise, and Pooja was already a month pregnant when they made their way back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Harvard University. The months spent living with her husband and her mother found Pooja unusually silent and docile. She allowed her mother to make all her decisions for her. After all, in some strange way, Rani enabled her behavior. She married Rahul, albeit under protest. She conceded to all her mother's suggestions, and those of her husband. Although Rahul did not beat and imprison her like her former captors, in reality it was an even more trying period of time for her. Mentally, although she was still a child in many ways, she had the needs, yearnings, and desires of an adult. She had all the trappings of a marriage, but no lover. Perhaps it would have been different for her if she had never savored the joy of being able to choose for herself. The concept of choice and the freedom it entailed was now only a fleeting memory. Like a bird that was finally allowed to fly free for a few months but was now back in a gilded cage, her resentment for her husband began to assert itself as hate. For the first time in her life, Pooja began to understand the value of love and freedom. It was love that entered her heart and illuminated it with freedom. It was freedom that began to enlighten her darkened mind. She understood that every human being was born free, but it was people and society that took that freedom away. In order for her to be free, she knew she had to make some hard choices. She would have to stop pleasing everyone around her and start making her own decisions instead of allowing others to decide for her. Societal laws would have to take a dent and social values would have to bend. She had to choose between her Hindu mother and her Muslim lover. She was considering cohabitation, in spite of her upbringing. She was not going to bother about religious or caste differences. As long as her choices didn't shackle her, and she was a consenting adult, then the rest of the world just had to deal with it. Pooja, her husband and mother left New Delhi and returned to the States when Pooja was 1.5 months pregnant. During their absence, Pooja's $5 million house, which she created for her Muslim lover and daughter, remained sealed. It was like a deserted castle. It was lifeless without her lover and their beloved daughter. During the trial of her lover, her daughter was referred to by some as a love child. She mused that the words could either be praise of her beautiful daughter or a mark of having done something wrong. All in all, her sadness wasn't simply the combined presence of her mother and her husband. It was the culmination of a system that also deprived her of her daughter and her lover. These two situations made it impossible for her to reconcile the fact that her mother had her best interests at heart. Who better to know what her interests were? Her home, now bereft of the very people who made it a home, was polluted by the presence of the very people who created her hell. She knew that she could not bring back life and happiness to her golden palace unless she first rid it of the intrusive guests and bring back the rightful occupants, her imprisoned king and their stolen princess. It was clear to her now that her Muslim lover and precious daughter had a far higher priority than her Hindu mother and high-priced husband. Pooja understood her problem, but her problem-solving skill denied her a workable solution. She still had many options. She could tell her mother that whatever had been done to her and her child in India was wrong and hurtful to both of them. She could also put her foot down and announce that she did not want to live with her Hindu husband because she did not love him, nor him, her. She could quite easily refuse to pay the second installment of her dowry and not give him a share in the equity of her house. She could tell Rahul to go to hell. If they objected, she would just have to remind them that they were no longer in India. This was America, and it stood for freedom and freedom to choose. Rani and Rahul could basically do nothing to force her to continue in a marriage she never wanted in the first place. The 7 vows she made to her husband in front of the Hindu pandit who conducted their wedding were of no consequence to her. Pooja instead decided to solve her problem like a teenager who was separated by her parents from her lover and forced to marry someone else. She decided to forsake her beautiful palace and run away. She did not want to live with her mother and husband again. She was scared that they might force her to stay with them forever and never allow her to meet or live with her Muslim lover again. Pooja knew that there was only 1 month left for her imprisoned lover to be set free. Wherefore, she decided to live in a hotel for a month, and when her husband was released she would meet up with him. Then, she would convince him to run away with her to another city or country, and there they could start over with a new palace and live happily ever after. Pooja made her escape in the early morning hours while her husband and mother were still asleep. Before she fled, she cut the sacred Hindu thread of Mangalstura from around her neck and placed it on a table in the living room. She took nothing with her except her small handbag. In her handbag, she had her identification documents such as her passport and bank book. Her papers and personal effects were given to her the previous night by her mother for the purpose of accompanying her husband to the bank on the following morning and transferring the other $3 million to his account. Her mother also handed over to her the ownership papers to her house. She had instructed her to go with her husband to a lawyer to have his name added to the deed to include his name as co-owner of her house. Pooja ran away at a time she was very much needed by her Hindu husband. Rahul wanted to get his remaining share of the dowry. After receiving the rest of his $3 million and having his name added to the deed on the house, Rahul planned to return to India as soon as possible and get his family inheritance sorted out. By marrying his auntie's daughter, he had fulfilled his mother's conditions and would now be eligible to inherit the 5 crores of his mother's bank balance and her 1.5 crore house in Baroda. When those assets were safely his, he would definitely return to Pooja's side. His motivations were simple. Pooja was a simple and naive girl, and he was going to steal as much as he could from her. After that, he would divorce her and find a suitable life partner who was articulate and educated. Pooja repulsed him. She was below his station. He found her naive, childish, uncivilized, and uneducated. She lacked many other skill sets for a modern wife. The way Pooja talked and behaved made him think of remote villagers in third-world countries. There was no way Rahul was going to be shackled to a simpleton like Pooja for the rest of his life. When Rahul and his mother finally awoke, their enthusiasm for the day's activities vanished. Pooja was missing and the Mangalastura was lying on the table in the living room. The broken frazzled thread of the Mangalastura told them everything. They both realized that bringing her to America was probably the worst error they could have ever made. Rani knew deep down inside exactly why this had happened. Rani decided to play the old manipulation game again. She convinced her son-in-law to go to the police and make a complaint. In his complaint, Rahul stated that his wife had been kidnapped. Rani also gave a statement to the police about the mental state of her daughter. In her statement, she mentioned that her daughter was suffering from some psychological problems and hence she was not capable of taking care of herself. The police did not see fit to question the claims of a mother and a husband and put out an all-points bulletin for Pooja Patel, neither did they wonder why the husband would have married such a seriously deficient woman.